Good morning, everybody. Today, I discuss one of the topics related to romantic literature, the romantic poetry. In the earlier sessions, we have discussed the origin of romanticism in England and how the romanticism was slowly building up in the end of 18th century and how the great precursors of romanticism developed romantic movement in England. The Romantic movement in England began officially with the publication of lyrical ballads in 1798, a joint publication by William Wordsworth and S.T. Coleridge. With this brief introduction, let me discuss the Romantic poetry with a special emphasis on William Wordsworth and S.T. Coleridge. William and Wordsworth and S.T. Coleridge are considered as the greatest of Romantic poets in England. Before we talk about Wordsworth and Coleridge, let's discuss something about Romantic poetry. And Romantic poetry, as we know, is the revolt against the artificial poetry of classical school of 18th century. There was a gradual shift from classicism to romanticism. This kind of a shift is seen in the poems of Collins, Cowper, Burns. In their poetry, we see this is what we call transitional poets. And in the poetry of transitional poets, we come to know that there are traces of romanticism. There is a desire for the liberty, and there is, in fact, a kind of revolt against the set classical rules. Obviously, with the coming of Wordsworth and Coleridge, the real glory of romantic period starts. So, the romanticism is seen in its full bloom with the publication of lyrical ballads. Besides, we have poets like Walter Scott, and in the later generation, we can see Shelley, Keats, Southey, and Moore contributing greatly to romantic poetry. These romantic poets share certain common characteristics. The romantic poets revolted against the poetic tradition of 18th century and turned to the nature. This is what they listened to. Rousseau's call, go back to nature. They focused on imagination, emotion, originality, and freedom in their poetry. The romantic poets are divided into two groups, the first generation and the second generation of poets. To the first generation belong William Wordsworth, S.T. Coleridge, and Robert Southey, and even Scott. And the second generation consists of the great poets like Lord Byron, P.B. Shelley, John Keats. Let's discuss the contribution of William Wordsworth to romantic poetry. William Wordsworth is considered to be one of the greatest romantic poets of 19th century. If we discuss little about his biographical details, Wordsworth was born at Cockermouth in Cumberland in 1770 to John Wordsworth and Anne Wordsworth. Of course, his mother died when he was very young, and he went to St. Joseph College. He took his BA degree and quit Cambridge with no fixed intentions as to his future career. He was influenced by French Revolution. In fact, he traveled to France in 1791 and fascinated by the French Revolution. When the fall of Bastille happened in 1789, Wordsworth wrote, with joy. He wrote, "Bliss it was in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven." It was such a great moment for him. Later, we come to know that Wordsworth was unhappy with the blood and horror, what we call reign of terror, and he returned to England. This is beautifully described in his famous poem, The Tintern Abbey. The turning point in Wordsworth's life is meeting Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Both became friends and both stayed in Lake District, and this collaboration is seen between 1797 and 1799. It was during this time Lyrical Ballads was published. The landmark is 1798. So, of course, Wordsworth married Mary Hutchinson, on whom he has written many poems. He became poet laureate in 1843 and died in 1850. This is a brief biographical detail about William Wordsworth. If you look into his poetic career and contribution to English poetry, the first edition of Lyrical Ballads was published in 1798, which we call the landmark or the beginning of Romanticism in England. And there are total 23 poems written by Wordsworth and Coleridge. And Coleridge's poems were 4 and remaining poems were from Wordsworth. And this was published again in 1800, for which Wordsworth wrote a famous preface in which he speaks about his theory of poetry. Wordsworth's major poetic works are poems in 2 volumes, which were published in 1807, and his famous odes, particularly Ode on Intimations of Immortality. The Excursion was published in 1814. And the Prelude, or the account of the growth of poet's mind, was published in 1850. We remember Wordsworth for his ardent worship of nature. We call him the high priest of nature. And Wordsworth believed in nature as teacher, nature as nurse, nature as the soul of all his moral being. In that way, this is beautifully described in his famous poem, Tintern Abbey. He enjoyed the dizzy joys and aching raptures. At the same time, he found the soothing factor in nature. Nature is a joy for Wordsworth. Nature is everything. All problems of man can be solved in nature itself. This is beautifully described in his famous poem, The Word is Too Much with Us. If you remember his lyrical ability, the lyrical ability of Wordsworth are found best in his poems like Daffodils. I quote him, "I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats over high vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake and beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze." He has written some bird poems like To the Cuckoo. He hears the sound, the song of cuckoo, at once near, at once far off. He believed in the theory A thing of beauty is a joy forever. This is again, evident in his poem, Daffodils. When on my couch I lie in vacant and pensive mood, they flash upon my inward eye. My heart with pleasure fills and dances with daffodils. He believes that a thing of beauty will continue to give you joy forever. He wrote wonderful poems, Lucy poems. Slumber did my spirit seal. Lucy Gray, she dwelled among the untrodden ways. The education of nature. He considered Lucy as an ideal human being. Unfortunately, Lucy lives only for 3 years. The period of innocence ends in 3 years only. So Lucy is portrayed as a real human being who is nurtured, educated by nature. That's a wonderful creation of Wordsworth in his poetry. He wrote wonderful poems like Michael, in which he speaks about the pastoral life, in which he speaks about the impact of industrialization, impact of urbanization also. So Wordsworth's Tintern is considered to be the most representative of his poetry. If you are not able to read all the poems of Wordsworth, it is said that read Tintern, you understand the essence of Wordsworth's poetry. I read out some of the quotes from his poems. The best portion of a good man's life is little, nameless, unremembered acts of kindness and love. What a meaningful quote. He also believed that nature never betrays man. Nature never did betray the heart that loved her. It's how he found soothing effect after his return from France. Again, he goes to Wye Valley with his sister Dorothy Wordsworth, and he found some kind of soothing spirit in Tintern Abbey. Wordsworth was also critical of his times because he hated growing materialism. That's why he writes in his famous sonnet, "The word is too much with us. Late and soon, getting and spending, we lay waste our powers. Little we see in nature that is ours. We have given our hearts away, a sordid boon." That's what he is speaking about. How we are losing little we see in nature. How we have become so mechanical. He had this kind of a vision long ago that the negative effect of materialism is beautifully discussed and described by William Wordsworth. He also writes a famous sonnet to Milton. Milton, thou should live at this hour. The pen, altar, and sword are corrupt. He wanted the champion of liberty, John Milton, to live at this hour. The country needs such a giant spirit. So, Wordsworth's poetry, whether it is his lyrics or odes or long autobiographical poem like The Prelude, are all talking about his belief in nature. They describe Wordsworth's theory of poetry. because Wordsworth beautifully writes about theory of poetry, which I may discuss when I talk about romantic prose. His theory of poetry is very, very clear. He describes poetry as the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings recollected in tranquility. He believed in the use of simple language, and he believed that the language of poetic composition is not different from language of common speech. With this, I'm going to conclude discussion on Wordsworth and take up the topic Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who lived between 1772 and 1834. Coleridge is another great poet of romantic period. He was a great friend of William Wordsworth. Born in 1772, he studied at Christ Hospital School in London. Christ Hospital is a famous school on which even Charles Lamb has written a famous essay, Christ Hospital. He was a classmate of S.T. Coleridge in Christ Hospital, the military discipline in Christ Hospital, the school which has produced admirals like Nelson. He was also influenced by revolutionary ideals. And when there was French Revolution, like Wordsworth, he wrote, "Liberty, the soul of life, shall reign, shall throb in every pulse, shall flow through every vein." So when the romantic poets are young, they wrote, uh, in reaction to the French Revolution. Coleridge was suffering from chronic rheumatism. That's why doctors prescribed him some drug, opium, but he developed addiction to this drug, which plagued him until his death in 1834. We talk about his opium dreams, we talk about his dream poetry, often attributed to his addiction and to drug. In 1797, he met William Wordsworth, and in 1799, he moved to Lake Districts. So, when it comes to his works, he wrote few poems, but one critic says all that is written by Coleridge in 20 or 30 pages should be bound in gold. He may not have written volumes of poetry like Wordsworth and other esteemed colleagues. He wrote few poems. When we talk about S.T. Coleridge, we remember his famous ballad, The Rime of Ancient Mariner, his famous poem, The Christabel, and another poem, Kubla Khan, and maybe he's always remembered for his prose work, Biographia Literaria. Rime of Ancient Mariner is an excellent ballad. It speaks about the mariner and his 200 sailors who were sailing in the sea, and how mariner comes across certain difficulties. In the beginning, it is ice. Coleridge describes the ice. The ship was not moving. Ice is here, ice is there, ice is everywhere. The Crucian soul, albatross came to the board. When albatross came, it came like a guest or Christian soul. The ship begins to move. But somehow The mariner took his bow and shot albatross without any reason. An albatross began to hang on his neck. The ship was stopped in the midst of the sea. This time it is hot, scorching sun, and their throats are parched, dried up. And here Coleridge writes beautifully, water, water everywhere, nor did a drop to drink. Water, water everywhere, nor any drop to drink. So, in this context, Rime of Ancient Mariner presents before us the world of supernatural. Here he writes about the dead sailors coming to life and steering the ship, the dead men steering the ship. There is life in death, death in life. All these ideas are beautifully described in Rime of Ancient Mariner. That's why some critics says Rime of Ancient Mariner is not just the story of crime and punishment, but of sin and expiation, papa and prayaschit. So sin and expiation, Mariner killed the bird who came to him like a guest. He received the bird hospitably and killed it inhospitably. It's like Macbeth killing his king in sleep. The King Duncan was murdered by Macbeth. The same situation you can see in Rime of Ancient Mariner. The mariner killed Albatross, which was like a Christian soul, which was a guest. For that, he repents later and he begins to tell the story to everybody. The poem actually begins with, the mariner catching hold of a wedding guest and telling them story. Christabel is another interesting poem. It is also unfinished poem, and in Christabel he speaks about the virtue and the vice. Christabel is a good girl, but she was in fact troubled by evil spirit called Geraldine. Kubla Khan is one of the best poems of it is also a fragment. It is said that he was disturbed by his friend while composing this poem after having seen the dream of Kubla Khan's pleasure dome. It's a wonderful presentation of nature, wonderful presentation of the pleasure dome built by Kubla Khan. So in this poem, you come to know about how the 5 miles meandering, the dome of pleasure, the sunny pleasure dome with caves of ice. It's a very interesting thing. This kind of wonders can be seen in romantic poetry, and particularly in the poems of S.T. Coleridge. Biographia Literaria is a classic text of literary criticism, and here it is in this book. He speaks about, in chapter number 13 and 14, he speaks about the theory of imagination and fancy. That's why Coleridge is very, very famous. If we look at some of the important quotes from Coleridge, it's very interesting to quote him. Some men are like musical glasses. To produce their finest tones, you must keep them wet. You must keep them wet. He also speaks about poetry. What is poetry? Poetry, the best words in the best order. The best words in the best order. He has some differences of opinion with William Wordsworth as far as the language of poetry is concerned. He wanted specialized diction for specialized poetry. If you can quote from his famous poem, Rhyme of Ancient Maranara, I again quote the famous lines, water, water everywhere, and all the boards did shrink. Water, water everywhere, nor any drop to drink. You have water, which can sink thousands of ships, but it cannot satisfy the little throat. You don't have a drinking water in which the sea. When Marinar was, when all the sailors were dead, he was feeling loneliness. Alone, alone, all alone, alone on the wide, wide sea. There's this repetition of the word alone, alone, all alone, alone on the wide, wide sea, the wideness of the sea. The loneliness are beautifully described by S.T. Coleridge. If I can quote from his Kubla Khan, these are beautiful lines. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree, whereof the sacred river ran through caverns measureless to man, down to a sunless sea. See the beauty of description. The name of the river, Alf, it's a sacred river, ran through caverns. Sometimes the river ran through caverns like Shalmala. Measureless to man, down to a sunless sea. This is a beautiful poem of S.T. Coleridge. So there are some informations about S.T. Coleridge's theory of imagination, Coleridge's nature. And to summarize, one can say both Wordsworth and Coleridge were the pioneers of Romantic era in English literature. Their literary revolution was successful. This shows both friends, particularly Wordsworth and Coleridge, they have differences of opinion, but when it comes to poetry, when it comes to their contribution, they are the great friends who jointly published lyrical ballads and heralded the beginning of Romanticism in England. With this, I'm going to close today's session, and I meet you again with another topic, romantic poets of second generation. Thank you.